Lost in translation, what Genesis never said about woman's origin. Genesis translation rib, biblical Hebrew woman origin, rib mistranslation, church and gender, feminine creation truth. What if the rib story wasn't in the Bible at all? What if it was a mistranslation? In Genesis 2:21, the original Hebrew doesn't say rib, it says Tsela, a word used for side, not a single bone. So what does this mean? The woman wasn't crafted from a leftover part. She was made from a full side, equal, complete, not derived from man, but alongside him. But when Tsela was translated into Latin and then into English, it became rib, small, secondary, removable. That one word shifted the perception of feminine identity for centuries. But if the original story never placed woman beneath man, then what else were we taught to misunderstand? Comment your thoughts. Have you ever questioned what else may have been mistranslated? Like if this shifted how you see sacred texts. Share to rewrite the story with truth. Save to keep this insight close. In part 2, we'll dive into the linguistic roots of Tsela and how it was used elsewhere in the Bible, not once meaning rib. Tsela never meant rib, uncovering the biblical word that was rewritten. Hebrew word Tsela meaning Bible mistranslation rib, original Genesis text, biblical Hebrew context, church and gender bias. If Tsela doesn't mean rib, what does it mean? In every other place the word Tsela appears in the Hebrew Bible, it means side or chamber. In the book of Exodus, Tsela is used to describe the sides of the Ark of the Covenant, not ribs, not bones, but structural halves. So why was it translated as rib in Genesis? Because side implies equality, but rib, that sounds less than. It turns the creation of woman into a derivative act, not a divine mirror. This wasn't just a linguistic slip. It was a subtle shift that shaped centuries of theology, culture, and gender roles. Language creates perception, and this word was weaponized to make women seem secondary by design. But the original text says otherwise. Comment below. Should sacred texts be retranslated with integrity or left as is? Like if this restored something sacred in you. Share if it's time to rewrite this story. Save to come back the next time someone calls you less than. In part 3, we'll explore how early scholars and church leaders reacted to this word and how their choices cemented the myth for generations. Who changed the word? The translators behind the rib myth. Bible translators' rib word. Church editing scripture. Rib myth origin. Gendered translation decisions. Biblical authority control. Who made the decision to turn a sacred word for side into a single submissive bone? It wasn't the authors of Genesis, it was the translators, centuries later. In the 4th century, St. Jerome translated the Bible into Latin, creating the Vulgate. Here, he chose the word costum, Latin for rib. Why? Because the idea of woman being made from a full side challenged the church's growing hierarchy, one where man stood above and woman below. A full side meant equality, but a rib, that supported a theology of subordination, and once it entered Latin, it spread through every translation that followed. The rib myth wasn't divine revelation, it was doctrinal strategy. Comment below, should modern translations correct ancient bias? Like if this exposed a crack in the foundation. Share to awaken someone still shaped by this myth. Save if you're ready to stand fully in your side, not your rib. In part 4, we'll explore how this single word changed not just theology, but laws, culture, and relationships for generations. From text to law, how the rib story shaped society for centuries. Rib story effects, religion and gender roles, biblical law and women, societal impact translation, woman inferiority myth. What happens when a single word echoes across centuries? The rib mistranslation didn't stay in theology. It crept into laws, marriage norms, education systems, and even women's rights. If woman came from man, then man was seen as source, as leader, as protector. And woman, a derivative, a helper, a subordinate. This shaped legal doctrines, From women's inability to own property, to being denied leadership roles, to being told their place was supportive, not sovereign. Even psychology followed suit. Freud's ideas of female lack, modern roles of submission in media, and generations of women raised to apologize for existing. But it all starts with one false word, a rib instead of a side. Language forms belief, and belief forms systems. Comment your thoughts. What belief about womanhood do you think came from mistranslation? Like if you feel the weight of inherited myths. Share if someone you know still sees supporting roles as sacred limits. Save to remember, you were never just a piece, you are a whole side. In part 5, we'll reveal what ancient Jewish scholars really believed about Tsela and why their view was far more balanced than later Christian dogma. What Jewish scholars actually said, the original view on woman's creation, Jewish interpretation, woman creation, Hebrew word, Tsela, Genesis and equality, ancient Jewish scholars, Torah gender roles. Before the church redefined womanhood, what did Jewish scholars actually say? In ancient Jewish thought, Tsela was never considered a literal rib. It was interpreted as side, symbolizing equality and dual design. The Talmud speaks of Adam being created androgynous, both male and female in one being, then separated into two equal parts. This wasn't a story of hierarchy, it was a story of separation for union, of balance, of mirrored souls. In the Midrash, some rabbis said the woman was made from the side closest to the heart to represent love and connection, not submission. Contrast that with later doctrines where Eve becomes the temptress and woman the source of sin. The original Jewish view was far more nuanced and far less misogynistic. So ask yourself, if the earliest readers of Genesis didn't see woman as less, why did later institutions rewrite her that way? Comment. Had you ever heard this version before? Like if this expanded your spiritual understanding. Share if someone you love deserves to know this truth. Save to remember that the original story honored your wholeness. In part 6, we'll trace how Eve's image shifted from sacred partner to seductive sinner, and what that did to generations of women, from partner to problem, how Eve became the scapegoat of humanity. Eve and original sin, biblical gender shift, church demonized woman, seduction myth theology, feminine blame narrative. How did Eve, a symbol of sacred partnership, become the scapegoat of humanity? In the Genesis story, Eve eats the fruit of knowledge, not out of malice, but out of curiosity, desire for wisdom, a yearning to know. Yet, for centuries, that act has been called disobedience, her name stained with sin, her voice silenced by shame. Early church fathers painted her as weaker, easily deceived, the reason for humanity's fall. And through her, all women were labeled dangerous, tempting, in need of male guidance. But what if Eve wasn't a warning, but a mirror? What if her choice was a revolution, an awakening, the moment humankind stepped into consciousness? Because knowledge isn't sin, and curiosity isn't corruption. It's the beginning of freedom. Comment below, was Eve punished, or was she the first to awaken? Like if this flipped the script for you. Share if someone you love still believes Eve was the problem. Save to remember, the search for truth is never a sin. In part 7, we'll dive into how Eve's fall was used to define womanhood, shaping purity culture, gender shame, and the fear of feminine power. How Eve's fall created purity culture and the fear of feminine power. Purity culture origins. Eve and shame. Fear of feminine power. Religious control women. Gender purity doctrine. What happens when a single story defines the nature of an entire gender? Eve's fall became the model for female guilt. Her desire became dangerous. Her curiosity became corruption. And her body, a temptation to be controlled. From that myth grew purity laws, modesty doctrines, and shame wrapped in scripture. Young girls taught to hide their bodies, to silence their voices, to believe their very being was a liability. Desire became taboo, pleasure became sin, and female agency became a threat, all rooted in the fear that a woman, if left unrestrained, might seek knowledge again. Because when women remember their power, systems of control begin to tremble. But the truth? Eve was never weak. She was aware, and awareness is power. Comment below, have you ever felt guilt for simply being curious? Like if this reframes everything you were taught. Share to help another soul break free from inherited shame. Save to reclaim your divine feminine strength. In Part 8, we'll uncover how the rib story was reclaimed by feminist theologians and what new interpretations are emerging today. Rewriting the rib, how women scholars are reclaiming the Genesis story. Feminist theology Genesis. Rewriting rib myth, women biblical scholars. Reclaiming sacred texts, gender, and scripture. What happens when women stop waiting to be interpreted and start interpreting themselves? Across the world, female scholars, theologians, and spiritual seekers are revisiting Genesis, not as passive readers, but as active translators. They're digging into the Hebrew, questioning centuries of patriarchal commentary, uncovering what was erased, what was twisted, and what was never there to begin with. And what they're finding? A Genesis story not of subordination, but of balance, not of shame, but of sacred duality. They're reframing Eve as a symbol of wisdom, not weakness, of boldness, not betrayal. And they're asking the questions that reshape everything. What if creation was never about hierarchy, but about harmony? These women aren't rewriting scripture to rebel. They're rewriting to remember, because when the story is told truthfully, everyone stands side by side, not one from the other's bone, but from the same breath. Comment below, what part of your spiritual story are you ready to reclaim? Like if this sparked something inside you. Share to amplify voices rewriting sacred stories. Save if you're ready to read your own soul with fresh eyes. In Part 9, we'll expose how modern churches still use the rib myth to maintain gender roles, and what it takes to break the pattern from within. The rib still rules, how modern churches enforce ancient gender roles, modern church gender roles. Rib narrative today, biblical womanhood control, female submission doctrine, religious gender norms. Think the rib myth is just ancient history? Think again. In sermons across the globe, pastors still preach. Man was created first. Woman came second. She was made to help, not lead. Submission is reframed as strength. Obedience becomes honor. And silence, they call it spiritual elegance. But the theology is the same. Man leads, woman follows. Entire ministries are built around biblical womanhood. Books, conferences, purity rings, a spiritual script based not on truth, but on a mistranslation, and it keeps evolving. Now, it's not just about Eve, it's about keeping women in line, through guilt wrapped in grace. But truth doesn't age, and falsehood, no matter how dressed up, can't hold under scrutiny. Comment below, have you heard these teachings in your church or community? Like if you're done with disguised control. Share if you know someone still caught in this system. Save to keep this awareness alive. In Part 10, the final chapter, we'll flip the story once and for all, reclaiming the origin not as division, but as divine unity. Not a rib, but a reflection. Reclaiming the divine feminine story, divine feminine origin, Genesis truth, woman not from rib, spiritual equality creation, sacred feminine restoration. She was never just a rib, she was always a reflection, an equal, a mirror of the divine, not formed beneath, but alongside, not made to follow, but to stand with. The real Genesis story isn't about hierarchy, it's about wholeness, the splitting of one soul into two bodies, meant to dance, not dominate, to co-create, not control. The myth of the rib was clever, but truth is stronger than myth. And now, we remember that the feminine was never a mistake, never an afterthought, never a helper at best. She is wisdom embodied, instinct, intuition, creation itself. So when you hear the old story again, smile, because you'll know better, and better is where we begin. Comment below. What's one belief about womanhood you're ready to rewrite? Like if this story felt like healing, share to awaken someone who forgot their worth. Save to carry this truth with you always. And if this series opened your eyes, subscribe, because the old stories are falling apart, and the new ones, we write them together.